In 1966, Blood Ridge wasn't a place that came to mind when death was mentioned. It was a narrow ridge of mountains in Logan County, West Virginia, where mornings began with smoke from cooking fires, the rumble of old pickup trucks, and familiar nods between neighbors. Here, people weren't rich, but they had enough coal for heating, enough wood for repairs, enough land to bury loved ones and remember their names. Boundaries weren't on maps, but in memory. Everyone on the ridge knew who owned which piece of land, because it had been passed down through generations, through words, stories, and beliefs. Blood Ridge survived because of its close-knit community. People borrowed each other's tools, babysat together, went down to the mines together, and returned together when night fell. No one locked their doors. No one suspected the silence, because silence here was habit, not a threat. But it was in this familiar peace that something began to shift. No noise, no violence. It was just a very slight sensation, like the ground gently shaking beneath our feet, foreshadowing that this place was about to change for the better. On Blood Ridge, people don't live by documents. They live by memories. Every bend in the dirt road, every decaying wooden fence, every old tree trunk carries a story that everyone knows. Who the land belongs to doesn't need to be asked of the court. Just ask the oldest person in the house. They remember every boundary line, not because they've seen it on a map, but because they once stood there with their fathers and grandfathers during those bitterly cold winters. Promises made on the porch are worth more than signatures. A handshake is enough to keep the land, the relationship, and the peace of the whole family. People borrow shovels and picks, exchange labor for labor, considering helping each other as a matter of course, without needing to remember or repay. When the men go down to the mines, the women babysit each other. When a family dies, the whole ridge comes together. No one needs to be invited. This trust isn't a noble thing. It's simply the only way to survive in a place where nature and poverty are ever-present threats. Blood Ridge survives thanks to those invisible bonds. And that's why no one realizes that when a promise begins to be doubted, when memories are replaced by documents, the entire community begins to face the risk of falling apart. Elijah Crowder lived in the upper part of Blood Ridge, where the road narrowed and the forest thinned out. His house was not large, not remarkable, just stood there quietly as it had for years. His parents died young. Crowder inherited the land at a young age and lived alone ever since. He never married, didn't participate in many community activities, but never bothered anyone either. At church, Crowder sat in the back row, sang softly, and left early. At the shop, he paid with cash, spoke just enough, no more. People knew him, but no one truly understood him. And on Blood Ridge, that didn't worry anyone. Silence was part of the local culture. Some people talked a lot to forget their hardships. Others spoke little to conserve energy for tomorrow. Crowder belonged to the latter. No one ever called him dangerous. No one ever whispered a word of caution when they saw him pass by. He was simply a quiet man, accustomed to living with the land and the forest, undemanding, uncontested. Therefore, when Elijah Crowder's name appeared in Blood Ridge's story, no one thought that this silence would become the most terrifying thing. Things really took a turn in late winter of 1966, when the name Elijah Crowder appeared not in campfire conversations, but in county office records. He had filed a coal mining permit. Neat, legitimate, and proper. No claim to land, no touching of houses, just something deep beneath the surface, a coal seam marked with thin lines on a geological map. On paper, it was a legitimate right, but on Blood Ridge, paperwork never carried the weight of memory. People read the records without fully understanding what those cold, hard terms were taking away. The lines drawn didn't match what they remembered. The markers placed didn't align with where their fathers and grandfathers had stood. Crowder said he wasn't taking anyone's land, only what belonged to him according to the law. He didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten, didn't argue. That very calmness confused everyone more. How could they fight against something emotionless, unyielding, and unwilling to listen to their story? For the people of Bloodridge, the land is more than just property. It's family history, a place marked by sweat and toil, a repository of the memories of those who have passed away. When the papers are laid out, confronted with things that cannot be proven with ink and red seals, they begin to understand that this dispute is more than just a legal matter. It's a clash of two worldviews, and one of them will have no place left. The changes on Bloodridge came without warning. They arrived early in the morning, when the dew still clung to the grass and the dirt road hadn't yet warmed. Newly erected wooden stakes were found in the edge of the woods, in neat rows. A streak of red paint was applied to the trunks of old trees that had stood there since their grandparents' time. No one came to explain. No one asked for their opinion. The markers simply appeared, as if they had always been there. From that moment, the familiar silence of Bloodridge began to transform. It was no longer peaceful, but wary. Conversations stopped when a stranger passed by. Gatherings ended earlier. Tools were no longer borrowed as before. People began to count their possessions, lock their doors at night, and do things they had never considered before. No one accused anyone. On Bloodridge, accusing without certainty was self-destructive. Instead, people withdrew. Each family retreated, clinging to their own piece of land and their own silence. The invisible bonds that had once held the community together began to loosen, not snap immediately, but weaken little by little. And in that void, fear crept in ever so subtly. Not loudly, not explicitly, just enough to make everyone understand that Bloodridge was no longer a place where everyone could rely on each other as before. On the 3rd of October 1966, Earl Denton did nothing unusual. He went up to his familiar hunting ground, where he had stood countless times, familiar with every rock, every slippery tree stump after the rain. By afternoon, Earl was found at the foot of a shallow slope, his hunting rifle a few steps away, wet leaves covering him like a thin blanket. All signs pointed to an accident, a slip, a momentary loss of balance. Such things were not uncommon on Bloodridge. The terrain was rugged, the hunting season long. Men often pushed themselves too far before winter arrived. Earl's family accepted that explanation, for they had no reason to think otherwise. Sheriff Gordon Hale arrived, documented the scene, signed the report, shook hands with a few acquaintances, and left. There was no debate, no formal questioning. Earl's death was added to the list of risks that life on the ridge forced people to accept, but for those sensitive enough to listen, the atmosphere had changed. The silence after the funeral was unlike anything before. It was longer, heavier, as if all of Bloodridge were holding their breath, not yet understanding that the first accident was only the beginning of a series of events no one wanted to name. 4 days after Earl Denton's funeral, Bloodridge awoke to black smoke once again. Naomi Fitch's small wooden house blazed before dawn, the fire spreading so rapidly that no one could do anything but watch. Naomi lived alone, familiar with her old stove and the wiring that had been with her for decades. As the ashes cooled, explanations quickly emerged. An accident caused by the stove, by the wiring. By old age and carelessness, people shook their heads, sighed, and called it bad luck. 2 deaths in such close proximity weighed heavily on people's hearts, but it wasn't enough for anyone to speak up. Bloodridge was accustomed to loss. Then there was Raymond Pike. He was found slumped in the cabin of his pickup truck on a logging road, the engine still warm. The smell of exhaust fumes lingered in the enclosed space. The conclusion, once again, sounded logical. A clogged exhaust pipe, gas poisoning, a healthy man robbed of his life by a small mistake. 3 deaths, 3 different explanations, each acceptable on its own. But when placed side by side, they began to create an unsettling feeling. People didn't say it out loud, but they started counting. Counting the days, counting the time, counting who would be the next to fall silent. Conversations now always end in evasiveness. When the name of the deceased is mentioned, the voice naturally lowers, as if afraid that speaking any louder will be heard. Bloodridge still doesn't call it murder. They call it a chain of accidents. But deep down, one thing is clear. These deaths no longer stand alone. They begin to connect through fear, through intuition, through the feeling that something is moving beneath the surface, slowly but deliberately. And when people realize it, it's too late to go back to the time when an accident was just an accident. When the 11th death occurred, Bloodridge could no longer find the strength to reassure itself. The number spread slowly, but as it reached each house, it weighed heavily. 11 people. 11 names who had sat at the same table, shared shifts, stood side by side in church. No one died in the same way, but all had vanished from the same community. Now, the fear was no longer vague. It had a form. It bore the name of darkened houses. People began to leave, quietly, without farewells. Some families packed up in the night, leaving empty porches and windows ajar. Others sent their children to town ahead, promising to follow when things settled down, a promise not always kept. On the dirt road, traffic thinned. At night, there was no longer the sound of laughter echoing from porch to porch. Only the wind and barking dogs remained, sounding quite different from before. The houses that once had smoke rising from their chimneys each morning now stand silent, curtains drawn, grass growing tall in the yards. The community that once lived on trust has shrunk into oases of fear, each family protecting itself with silence. Bloodridge didn't collapse in a single moment. It disintegrated slowly as each person realized that the greatest danger wasn't leaving, but staying another day. Sheriff Gordon Hale knew Bloodridge had changed, but he had no words to describe it. He was born and raised there, accustomed to accidents, to loss, to the way the mountains concealed more than they revealed. Each death was recorded individually, according to the procedures his small office could follow. A fall, a house fire, a car accident. Files were created, signed, and then put away. There was no common map. No one putting all the names on a single page. The investigation was fragmented, much like the terrain of Bloodridge, difficult roads, seemingly close distances, yet vast distances. Evidence washed away by rain, traces buried under rocks and debris, witness memories eroded by fear. People answered cautiously, not because they were hiding something, but because they feared saying the wrong thing. Every word now could become a burden. When the case was closed, no one believed the truth had been found, but no one had the strength to demand more. The truth wasn't concealed by violence. It was missed, piece by piece, in an investigation that never had the chance to see the whole picture. After that winter, Bloodridge gradually faded from the memory of the rest of the county. No more news, no more questions. The deaths were relegated to a dark period, a series of misfortunes everyone wanted to forget in order to move on. 15 years passed in silence. The abandoned houses deteriorated with time, the wooden porches rotting, the windows covered in dust. Children grew up elsewhere, hearing of Bloodridge only as a faded name in the memories of adults. Those who remained learned to live with the void. They no longer mentioned the lost names, not because they didn't remember, but because they remembered too much. Coal was still mined. Heavy trucks rolled along the roads that once echoed with laughter. Paperwork was completed, boundaries were clarified, as if everything had been settled. But that silence was not peace. It was a layer of dust covering an untold story. Bloodridge was not healed. It was simply forgotten. And in that oblivion, the truth lay dormant, waiting for someone patient enough to uncover what everyone had deliberately ignored. In 1981, Bloodridge returned, not with sad stories, but with cold numbers on a prosecutor's desk. Daniel Rohr didn't grow up there. He didn't know the dirt roads. He didn't remember the vanished names. What he trusted wasn't human memory, but papers. Rohr had a habit of reading slowly, carefully, until the smallest details began to contradict each other. In a stack of seemingly harmless coal mining files, he saw the name Bloodridge appear repeatedly, always at the edge of the page, always accompanied by inexplicable adjustments. Boundaries shifted slightly, signatures were duplicated, dates changed to benefit the same group of people. There was no blood in those papers, but something else was more obvious: self-interest. Rohr began stacking the documents side by side, like piecing together a picture no one wanted to look at anymore. He realized that after each death from years past, a legal obstacle disappeared. After each funeral, a file was streamlined. What the Bloodridge community could not preserve with memory and promise had been taken away by procedure and seals. When Rohr asked to reopen the old documents, the dust was so thick that it had to be wiped away before it could be read. In those faded pages, he saw no accident. He saw a series of decisions. And for the first time in 15 years, someone looked at Bloodridge not with fear or avoidance, but with the patience necessary to force the truth to reveal itself. When Daniel Rohr placed all the files on one table, the final picture emerged in an undeniable way. The deaths of 1,966 were not a series of random accidents. They were orderly. There was distance between them. There was purpose. With each person who fell, a legal knot was untied. With each funeral that closed, an underground boundary became clearer. The truth did not come through a shocking discovery, but through the cold repetition of self-interest. The financial documents tell a story that witnesses dare not tell. Land was transferred with unusual speed. Exploitation rights were consolidated in just a few months. Compensation and debts were handled neatly, as if someone had already prepared a path for the pain to pass. The victims' families, exhausted by their loss, signed papers they were too weak to read. No one needed to threaten them directly. Just patience, just waiting for the right moment. Reviewed forensic results revealed something even more disturbing. Repeated tracks were found at two different scenes. The signs of fire were inconsistent with an accident. The concentration of gases in a vehicle couldn't simply be due to a technical malfunction. Each small detail, taken individually, could be overlooked. But when put together, they all said the same thing. The accident was staged to look like an accident. What made Bloodridge tremble wasn't the brutality, but the efficiency. There was no rage, no personal revenge, only problems that needed solving. And for those behind desks, death became an option. Quiet, neat, leaving the fewest questions. In that moment, the truth became painfully clear. Lives were weighed down like numbers, erased so that the flow of profit would be straighter. Bloodridge lost not just people. It lost the illusion that evil always comes with a lot of noise. The Bloodridge trial never unfolded as expected. When the charges were finalized, when the last names were read, Elijah Crowder was no longer the quiet man he once was on the hillside. Age and disease had worn him down rapidly, as if time itself wanted to close this story in its own way. In the cold prison cell, Crowder died before the sentence was pronounced. No plea. No moment to face the families who had waited 15 years. To the law, that death was a period. To Bloodridge, it was just another void. The victim's relatives sat in silence when the news broke, unsure whether to feel relieved or outraged. Justice had arrived, but there wasn't enough time to say everything that needed to be said. Crowder passed away with his familiar silence, leaving behind an incomplete trial. There, the truth was called, but the feeling of fairness never truly arrived. And for many, that was the final pain Bloodridge left behind. Today, Bloodridge is not the same as it once was. The dirt road is still there, but there are fewer tire tracks. The houses that once lit up every night are silent, their curtains drawn as if no one needs to look outside anymore. The forest is beginning to reclaim what humanity left behind. Survey stakes are rotting. The paint on the trees is fading. Nature is very good at covering things up, but it cannot erase memories. Those who left occasionally return, standing silently before the old ground, calling out the names of those who are gone. There is no grand memorial, no formal ceremony. Only the belated acknowledgement that 11 people once disappeared here, not by fate, but by self-interest. Bloodridge did not fall to the sound of gunfire. It disintegrated in silence, in moments of turning away out of fear, weariness, and the belief that it didn't concern them. The remaining question isn't, who did it? The question is, why it took 15 years for the truth to be revealed. How many people knew, or sensed, something was wrong, but chose silence to move on. Bloodridge is quiet today, but not peaceful. It's a reminder that evil doesn't always scream. Sometimes, it just needs convenience and enough people to turn their backs. And the unanswered question remains, hanging in the air between the forest and the land. If the same thing happens again, will we speak out, or will we choose silence again, like Bloodridge did all those years ago?